Good evening. Welcome to the Marines Memorial. I'm Mike Myatt. I'm President and CEO of the Marines Memorial Association. The Marines Memorial Association is a war veterans organization chartered to commemorate the service and sacrifice of veterans like you. We honor the legacy of military service through programs like this where we commemorate, educate, and serve the public. Well, I'd really like to have you here tonight. I'm supposed to introduce George Shultz. Now, George Shultz doesn't need an introduction.
Okay, that's enough.
So I'm going to sit down and he's going to tell us about his book, Learning from Experiences. And they're going to be for sale out in our lobby afterwards, if you don't have one yet. So I'll shut up and let him go.
Well, learning from experience is my way of saying, you know a lot maybe, but when it comes to really working through problems, it's what you've learned from your experience that counts, what you realize. Here's a little story. I was on the MIT faculty years ago. And a guy gets up in a faculty meeting named Bemis, and he's new. And he says, I'm very proud to be a member of this faculty. Shows what my administration, my colleagues think of me. But maybe you'd be interested in what a couple of the old timers in a little town in Maine where I grew up think. A couple are sitting by the radio, announcement comes through. Bemis made a professor at MIT. And one says to the other, I'm not surprised, right from the first grade he was a smart kid. The other one said, that's right, that Bemis, he got so he knew more and more all the time. The other one says, that's right, by this time that Bemis knows everything. The other one said, that Bemis, he may know everything, but he don't realize nothing. So we all know you see often people who are very smart, but somehow they don't get it. It's what you realize that matters. So what I thought I would do is take three things that happened to me while I was in the Marines in World War II, what I learned from them, and then take the playbook that basically I realized out of my time as Secretary of State with President Reagan. And if there's time, I might apply that to some problem. So that's the playbook. Well, first of all, I'm in boot camp in the Marine Corps. I remember the day the sergeant hands me my rifle. He says, take good care of this rifle. This is your best friend. And remember one thing. Never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull the trigger. No empty threats. Boot camp wisdom. We have empty threats lying all over the landscape now. It's one of our problems. Nobody pays attention to you if you don't mean what you say and be able to follow through. So I call that boot camp wisdom. I told that story to President Reagan. We were very careful with what we said. Words are precious. Once you issue them, you can't get them back again. So boot camp wisdom, no empty threats. That's realization number one. Number two, we'd taken this little island out in the Pacific, and we were there, and there was a nearby island where the natives were, and the Marines like to go over and buy grass skirts and log canoes and stuff like that to send home for souvenirs. So we had a deal where they could go over for 2 hours, and I went over and watched this process. And the natives enjoyed the process. The Marines wanted to make deals. Guess what happened to the prices? So finally I had to step in and I said, look, you set a price and the Marines can decide whether they want to buy or not. But when you see the Marines wanting to make deals and the natives wanting to keep the process going, guess what happens to the prices? You can't want a deal too much. The guy who wants a deal too much will get his head handed to him every time. So sometimes when I was in office, congressional committees would say, aren't you upset you haven't made a deal with the Soviet Union? I said, we're not interested in a deal. We're interested in a good deal. When a good deal comes along, then we'll take it, but not until then. So that's the second experience from which I realized something. The third was fairly early in my deployments in combat, And we were sort of defenseless on this island. The Japanese would come and rake us over. And I had, you get into these, so you get very close to people. And I had a sergeant named Patton that I thought the world of. He was very able, could do anything. You relied on these sergeants. So we have some action. And I'm looking around for Patton. I run over to where I thought Patton was. I said, "What the hell's Patton?" Patton's dead, sir. I'll never forget it. The reality of war sinks in. Wonderful people get killed, injured. So if you're ever in a position to have any impact on a presidential decision to send people into conflict, remember Patton. Be careful. Be sure you have a good mission. Be sure you equip people to be able to achieve the goal that you set out for them, and do it in a way that minimizes the loss of life. So these 3 lessons from the Marine Corps experience were very important in my subsequent career. And lots of other things are in the book, from my early childhood days to college days, Marine Corps, my time at MIT and Stanford, my time in various cabinet posts. So I had a lot of experiences to learn from, and I try to lay them out in the book. But let me take the Reagan period in foreign policy. I think most people felt our foreign policy worked pretty well. So here's the way we evolved a pattern of how to think about whatever problem there is. First of all, remember boot camp wisdom. Get it established that you mean what you say, and you can carry out what you set out to carry out. Ronald Reagan had something happen early in his presidency that hit the world pretty hard. You remember the air traffic controllers went on strike. And people kept running into the office, "Mr. President, this is very complicated." He said, "It's not complicated." They took an oath of office, they violated it, they're out. And people said, "Is the man crazy? How are you going to keep the planes flying?" All over the world they said crazy. But he had enough experience from being governor of California that he knew he had to execute. And he had a secretary of transportation who had been chief executive of a large transportation company. So he understood the problem. And he also knew how to get something accomplished. So working with the president, first they manned the towers with management people and military people. And they had an aggressive recruiting and training program, and they kept the planes flying. And all over the world, people said, "Hey, watch your step. The guy plays for keeps." So he established the fact that he meant what he said, could take a stand on principle, and then he could make it work. That's essential. Once you establish yourself that way, people pay attention to you. And if you don't establish that, it's hard to get very far. So that's point 1. Point 2, be realistic. Throw away your rose-colored glasses. See the world as it is. That doesn't mean there aren't some good things. You see good things, recognize them. But there's a lot of tough stuff out there, and you better be clear about it in your mind. Don't kid yourself. So that's very important. I remember in the Reagan period, he called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and people went bananas. So my friend Paul Nitze was testifying, and one of the senators said to him, "Paul, how can you serve in an administration where the president calls the Soviet Union an evil empire?" And Paul said, "Senator, have you considered the possibility that the statement might be accurate?" Ended the hearing. But it was realism. And that's really important. Then you have to have strength. Of course, military strength. But you can't have real military strength unless your economy is strong. So we set out early on to rebuild the military, not only in terms of the numbers and the equipment and all that, but when we took office, the military weren't even wearing their uniforms into the Pentagon. And President Reagan said, "Wear your uniform, stand up, be proud." And people started doing it, and the whole spirit changed. So The strength is partly the military itself, the economic underpinnings, but also the sense of commitment and feeling good about yourself and proud of yourself. So that's strength. Then, on the basis of all this, you ask yourself, what is your agenda? What do you want to get out of this negotiation? Don't think about the other guy's agenda, or you'll wind up negotiating with yourself. What's your agenda? Then once you have these established, you have then to go and engage. But this is the way to think about a problem that comes up. So not long ago, we had General Dumford here. And I remember he was on this stage, and he told us what he thought the main foreign policy problems were. There's Russia, there's China, there's North Korea, there's Iran, and there's the ISIS. That was his summary. And pretty good summary. I thought his speech was terrific. We're lucky to have him. I must say, having once talked with him when he was commandant, I had a kind of a feeling, I'd rather be commandant than I would chairman of the chiefs. But anyway, he did what he asked to do, and doing a fantastic job. So let's take one of his issues, Russia. What do we do about Russia? Well, first of all, let's look realistically at the situation. Russia is playing a weak hand aggressively. And they're getting along in it because they're not getting pushback. Let's consider where they are. They have a demographic catastrophe on their hands. Fertility is low. A quarter of the men die before they each reach the age of 55. Their longevity is not very long. They're very dependent on oil and gas, and the prices have collapsed. So they have their weaknesses. They've had practically an open rebellion in the Caucasus. They have a long border with China. And there's sort of an infiltration taking place. And it just happens because on one side you have a lot of people, not much resources. On the other side you have a lot of resources and not many people, and it just happens. I remember the joke in the old days, when the Soviet Union days, was guy comes running into the Secretary General, said, "Mr. Secretary General, people are swarming into Red Square." He says, "Fine, what's the problem? It's a beautiful square, let them come in." "Yes, but Mr. General Secretary, they're eating." "Well, isn't that good? We have plenty of food." "It's a great thing." "No, but Mr. General, they're using chopsticks." So this has been around, this problem has been around. They do have a substantial cache of nuclear weapons, and they have other weaponry. And Mr. Putin's popularity goes up whenever he does some adventure, whether it's in Georgia or the Ukraine or in Syria or wherever it is. An adventure like that makes him look good. And it kind of takes away from people seeing the reality that's there. So that's one side of it. So what do? Well, first of all, it seems to me we need to be willing to give arms to the Ukrainians. They have their boots on the ground. That's fine. We don't have to have boots on the ground, but we need to equip them so they can fight for themselves. And be willing to do that, stand up to that. Then the Baltic countries and the Eastern Europeans, the Poles and others, they're very nervous about all this. And if you're, say, Estonia, President of Estonia was here not long ago, 25% of their population is Russian. About half of it lives on the border. All they hear is Russian television. So they feel very vulnerable. Furthermore, they're very dependent on Russia for their oil and gas supplies. And Russia has demonstrated it's willing to cut it off in the middle of the winter and let you freeze to death. So you got that. So what should we do? Well, we need to have NATO put troops in the Baltic countries. That's happening. I'm glad to see that happening. We need to do that. We could very easily get up an energy initiative. I don't see why we don't do it. We can produce lots of oil and gas these days. Let's have LNG produced and provide those states with a flow of energy from elsewhere. They don't have to depend on Russia. Doesn't mean they cut themselves off entirely, but they are not dependent, and we have a surge capacity so that if Russia cuts it off, we can supply. And you take a lot of the oomph out of that. Then I think we should gear up our radios again. During World War II, we had Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe. And we have all the archives of those radios in the Hoover Institution. We had a conference a few years ago, and at it were people who studied that archival material, people who had run BBC and Voice of America and so on, and some people from behind the Iron Curtain who were officials and others. And we had two questions. Number one, did anything work? And number two, what did we learn in the process? It was a hands-down conclusion that these radios were very effective. And we learned a lot in the process. We learned, for example, you better be absolutely vigilant that you're always accurate. And some of the officials who were behind the Iron Curtain would tell us, they'd say, I know my own country's stuff is propaganda, so I get my information from the radios because I know that they're going to be accurate. Even if something unpleasant happens, they'll say it. So a lot was learned. And we can crank that ability up again to project a point of view. We just let the Russians dominate the airwaves, and we need to fight back on that. So we have some troops deployed. We do take care of the energy side. And then we make it clear. We mean what we say. We can execute what we set out to execute. And we're ready to be in a solid spot. Then I think we also need to recognize their weakness. The worst thing in the world would be a collapse of Russia. So we need to make it clear that if that begins to happen, we're there to try to work through. Because I think one of the things that worries me the most is nuclear weapons. Probably you all know Bill Swing, retired Bishop of California. He put out a little piece about a month or so ago, stunning. And he says, we are electing not just a president, we're electing a God. You put your hand on the Bible and swear, that's just the beginning. The real problem is when you put your hand on the nuclear button and you have a nuclear exchange and kill 1 million people, you think you're God. This is a dangerous thing. And Russia is talking, I think, very loose about nuclear weapons. It's not wise. And we'll have to handle this situation with great care, because any kind of a nuclear exchange is devastating, not just to the people who happen to be on the receiving end of the nuclear weapons, but it changes the whole atmosphere. It's been pretty well documented. Back in the Cold War days, do you remember the Chernobyl accident? Big nuclear power plant accident, gigantic thing, huge. It's still being coped with. And I was fascinated to find that the first meeting I had with Mikhail Gorbachev after that accident, that he had asked the same question I had. I'd gone to our people and I'd said, what's the relationship between the damage done at Chernobyl that we see and what would have happened there if there had been a nuclear weapon dropped? Answer, nuclear weapon, far more devastating. That kind of gave us a feel for how devastating these weapons are. And it's important to realize that, to take it in, because it's horrible. So we have to worry about that subject. Early in his presidency, President Reagan asked the Joint Chiefs what would happen to the United States if there were an all-out Soviet attack on us. Answer, it would wipe us out as a country. Gone. Would he retaliate? Yes, same thing. So I heard him say many times, what's so good about keeping the peace by an ability to wipe each other out? So we sought to reduce nuclear weapons. That was before the negotiations were SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation talks. We had START, Strategic Arms Reduction talks. And we called for the complete elimination of intermediate-range nuclear weapons. There were some strong things there, and one of the things it taught me was the difference between strength and the use of force. Strength is much more important. Here's what happened. The Soviets deployed intermediate-range nuclear forces in the Soviet space that could hit European countries and hit Japan and hit China, but couldn't hit us. And the diplomatic ploy was, would we risk retaliation by their intercontinental missiles by retaliating against their use of these intermediate ranges? So we had a deal in NATO that we would have a negotiation with the Soviets, and if we couldn't get a reasonable agreement, we would deploy our own intermediate-range nuclear weapons. And it was a wild negotiation, and in the end, we couldn't reach an agreement. So first we deployed cruise missiles in Britain. Margaret Thatcher was able to carry that forward. Then we deployed cruise missiles in Italy. Prime Minister Andreotti was good on that. But then the big deal was deploying ballistic missiles in Germany. This was a huge thing. And there was a big controversy, but our allies held firm, worked with each other, and the Germans did it. It was Helmut Kohl's finest hour. The Soviets walked out of negotiations. They fanned war talk, and we held firm. And then gradually over the next year, things gradually softened, because this was a massive show of strength. Not a shot was fired, but it was a massive show of strength. And by August, I was able to go to the president and say, Mr. President, at 4 different European cities, a Soviet diplomat has come up to us of ours at a cocktail party and said virtually the same thing, which we think comes down to, if Gromyko is invited to Washington, when he comes to the General Assembly in September, he'll accept. In other words, the Soviets blinked. And I said, Mr. President, you probably want to think this over, because President Carter stopped these meetings when they invaded Afghanistan, and they're still there. He said, I don't have to think it over, let's get him here. So he came. It was a giant event. And here's a little fun thing that happened. Nancy Reagan was a pal of mine. She always fixed me up with a starlet, Hollywood starlet at a White House dinner. I got to dance with Ginger Rogers, and it was good. So I went to Nancy. I said, Nancy, the deal is, he comes into the West Wing. We sit around in the Oval Office. We have a meeting. Then we walk down the colonnade to the mansion. That's your home. And we have some stand-around time. Then there's a working lunch. So it's your home. How about you being there for the stand-around time? The host would be a nice touch. And she said, fine, I'd like to do that. So we walked down there, and Gromyko, as soon as he sees Nancy, he goes right over to her, smart guy. And Nancy could bristle, and he says to her, does your husband want peace? And Nancy says, of course my husband wants peace. And then he says, well, then every night before he goes to sleep, whisper in his ear, peace. He was a little taller than she was, so she put her hands on his shoulders and pulled him down, so he had to bend his knee. And she said, I'll whisper it in your ear, peace. I said, Nancy, you just won the Cold War. But the big lesson there is the show of strength to deploy against that propaganda windmill was a massive show of strength, and we put weapons in there that you had to respect. Not a shot was fired. But I think in many respects that was the turning point in the Cold War. So you learn a lot from your experiences. I think everybody has them, and you think about them. You learn a great deal. And So I've reflected on mine in this book and tried to bring them out from my early days to college, to Marine Corps, to my time at MIT and the University of Chicago, Stanford, and then my time in the various cabinet posts. I learned a lot from those posts. One of the most interesting things and rewarding things I ever took part in, this will be my final story, was the desegregation of schools in the South. I had been with Clark Kerr, chairman of something called the Armor Automation Fund. This was in the 1960s when, things were wild. We had Watts, we had riots all over the place. And the meatpacking industry was going a big change. They had these pig packing plants in Chicago, Kansas City, Fort Worth. They'd drive the animals to the big plants, and there they'd be butchered and so on. And they began to think, the animals lose a lot of weight when they're being driven all that distance. So why don't we have smaller packing plants out where the animals are? So this was the reason. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of displacement and so on. The fund was created by the union and the management. Clark and I are co-chairmen. So the company is building a new plant in a little town called Worthington, Minnesota. And the town is happy to have it. The meatpacking jobs were good jobs in those days. Tiny little town. And when the plant was about 3/4 of the way built, and it's getting to be close to fruition, the company closes a plant in Kansas City. Big plant, been there a long time. Most of the workers in the plant were black, and they had lots of seniority. And in the contract, if you had a lot of seniority, you could bump into another plant. So a lot of them could bump into this new plant. So I go to Worthington, and I find there are no black people in Worthington at all. It's not that anybody discriminates against, there just aren't any. Never had, never saw one. So the governor's human relations guy comes and says, you got to stop this. We said, wait a minute. These people have contractual rights. It's up to us to do what we can to make it work. So we start talking to the town fathers. And after a while, they begin to say, big cities, they don't know anything about people. We're a little town. Everybody knows each other. They're people. We can handle it. And then the blacks started sending scouting parties up. We helped them get around and know the people. And then all of a sudden it emerged, a lot of them were tithers. So the churches started to compete for them. I said to Clark, we just turned a corner. In the end, about a little over 200 came to Worthington. There were no problems. It worked. So that got quite a bit of publicity, more than they really wanted. But it was sort of so different from everything else going on that people noticed it. So in October 1970, I'm Secretary of Labor. President Nixon decides to desegregate the schools in 7 southern states. They were still segregated by law. This is 60 years after the Brown decision. Been there a long time. And so it obviously was going to be controversial. So he appoints a group to cabinet people to manage it. I'm the vice chairman. Vice President Agnew is the chairman. Agnew will have nothing to do with it. So I become the de facto chairman. And I had Pat Moynihan was in the White House. He and I worked on it, and I had a lawyer named Len Garment. And we decided, I'm thinking about Worthington experience. And I said, let us form biracial committees in each state. And let's tell the president we're going to pay no attention to the politics of these people. We don't care whether Republicans or Democrats, what they're. What we want are strong, respected people. That's what we want. So that's what we got. And everybody said the toughest state would be Mississippi. So we invite them up to the White House. We take them into the Roosevelt Room. And I realized from my earlier experience in labor relations that you got to let people blow off steam. But as long as they're blowing off steam and talking about principles, you're never going to get anywhere, but you got to let them do it. So I let them blow off steam. And the whites all said this is a terrible idea, and the blacks said it's a good thing. And I let him do that. Then I brought in the Attorney General. I said, what are you going to do when the school's open? I'm going to enforce the law. Thank you. Goodbye. So then I could say to the people, well, it's been an interesting discussion this morning, but it's irrelevant. It's going to happen. And the only question is, how will it work? Will there be violence? What's happened to the quality of education? After all, these are your children. These are your communities. These are your schools. So that was setting a problem. So they started to bite on a problem. As soon as you get people talking about what problems are going to be and what can we do, then you begin to get somewhere. So I took them over to the State Department diplomatic reception rooms for lunch. And there is the desk that Thomas Jefferson built himself, on which he wrote large portions of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. So they saw the desk. And they came back to the White House, and by about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, people were very constructive, talking about problems, what could be done about them, and so on. So then we go across the aisle into the Oval Office, and the president says, well, here we are in the Oval Office. Think of the decisions that have been made here that affect the welfare and security of our country. Well, here we have this major issue, desegregation of schools. He said, I've made my decision. But in a country like ours, that's not near enough. People in the states and communities have got to make theirs. That's why you're here. And ready to work with you to make this go. And they talked about it some, and they all left kind of on cloud nine. They were good. So we come to we get each state, and it goes more or less the same way. Pat and I are, by this time, we're pretty confident we can pull it off. So we come to the last state is Louisiana. And we had the idea, well, we can do this down in Louisiana, and then we'll have a meeting of the co-chairmen of all the different states together. And the school openings were not that far away. It would be a good kind of kickoff. So we have a meeting in the Oval Office. I make my pitch. And Vice President Agnew is there. He says, Mr. President, don't go. There you'll be in a room. Half the people will be black, half the people will be white. It's going to be blood running through the streets of the South. If you go, then the blood will be on your hands. So the president looks at me. I say, well, Mr. President, whatever happens, it's on your watch. And you've met with the people that have come up here. They're good people. They haven't been idle. We've been working with them. So I think we should do everything we can to make this work. And if we have this meeting of the co-chairman, that'll do it. So he decides to go. So Pat and I go down to New Orleans. And we're working with them. We're getting somewhere, but it isn't quite as good. It's dawning on me. It's one thing to bring people to the White House. It's another thing to meet in a hotel room in their hometown. It's not the same. But we were pretty good. By the time the president arrives, I said to him, Mr. President, half of me is thinking of Agnew. So they're not quite the way they usually are when we bring him into the Oval Office. You're going to have to put this over yourself, which he did. And then we had the meeting with the co-chairman. It was like a revival meeting. They're all exchanging ideas about what problem, what you're going to do, and so on. It was inspirational. So as it turned out, the schools opened and there was no violence. And it was very rewarding to see that kind of action take place. So I was learning from experience as I went along. So that's all I've got.
President Reagan told you once, when you were prepared a speech about an important foreign policy decision that he had made, that he would like you to tell a story with it too, so that people learn from the gut. You certainly have those stories to tell. You really do.
Yeah, but I remember that he had made a reasonably important foreign policy decision. He gave me the job of announcing it and explaining it. So I very carefully wrote out this speech, and I brought it over to him. We had 2 private meetings a week. And I said, Mr. President, you wanted me to do this, and I've written this out. Would you mind taking a look at it? I want to be sure it's the way you want it. So he picks it up, and he leafs through it. He says, perfect. He puts it down. There was dead silence. And he said, of course, if I was doing it, I wouldn't do it this way. And he said, you've written this speech out to be read, and that's appropriate. But I give a speech to people who are in front of me or in the other TV camera. And he picked it up and he flipped it open at random. There were marks all over it. He personalized it. In one place he put a little caret, he put story. And I looked at it and I said, well, I understand what you're doing here, but what's the story about? He said, that's the most important point on this page. And if you want to get it across to people, it's not enough to get it into their heads. You got it into their gut. And the way you get it into their gut is you tell them a story that they can relate to. Then they get it. It was the same point. You know something, but what you realize is what hits you in the gut and is important. So I said, well, that's another of my know, but realize is more important.
Yeah. Sir, in 2006, you went public with 3 or 4 other men wanting to eliminate nuclear weapons. Where does that stand today?
Well, as I said earlier, I'm very upset about the nuclear weapons situation right now. As I said, we worked at it in the Reagan period, and with Gorbachev, we managed to get agreements that wound up with the nuclear weapons today that exist are about 1/3 of what they were at the height of the Cold War. But the situation is different. Russians are playing around with the subject. They're threatening nuclear weapons use. There's proliferation. North Korea has nuclear weapons. Iran obviously wants them, and sooner or later probably get them. And that will lead others, no doubt. Saudi Arabia can buy them from Pakistan. Pakistan and India are on the edge all the time. They both have nuclear weapons, the nuclear weapons in North Korea. So it's a very nervous situation. And Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, Bill Perry, and I wrote this piece. And we didn't just call for an end to nuclear weapons. We said, here are the kind of steps you have to take to get there. Sam put it, it's like we're on the side of a mountain. At the bottom of the mountain are lots of nuclear weapons, and they might go off. At the top of the mountain is a world free of nuclear weapons, and we got to find a pathway to get to the top. And that's what our article said. But it's very discouraging right now. It's all going in the wrong direction. So I think, first of all, we have to get it into people's minds and into their gut, their realization that these weapons are not tolerable. You think you're God? We've got to do something about them. And we have to get people to have a sense of how destructive they can be. I thought during the Cold War period, I mentioned that Gorbachev and I both had said, what's the difference between what happened in Chernobyl and what the nuclear weapon had been done? So it gave you a kind of a vivid gut feeling about how destructive these things are. And of course, people of our age all remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the utter destruction. And the weapons today are hundreds of times more powerful than those weapons. A nuclear weapon today, it would incinerate the Bay Area, gone. Berlin, gone. Moscow, gone. Washington, New York, gone. Just bang, they're gone. So I worry about it a lot. And I think we got to get back to the idea of appreciating how dangerous they are. And somehow, if we can, get back to the point where we're trying to get them down. But we're a long ways from that. And we have things like the North Korean thing that was there. So there's a lot of work to do.
Sir, General Dunford was just here as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he could talk. You said that today. What would you do about defense spending? Do we need to increase it or what?
Well, I think the situation is very much like it was when we came in the Reagan period. Remember when Ronald Reagan took office, when we took office, inflation was in the teens, the prime rate was in the 20s. Our military was down, they wouldn't wear their uniforms. Nothing had been done since Vietnam. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. Jimmy Carter had cut off all contacts with them. The Cold War was as cold as it could get. And we left office, the economy was doing great. The inflation was under control and the Cold War was all over but the shouting. So a lot went on in that period. And I've tried to discuss the ins and outs of it. But it's hard to know how we get back to negotiating. But here's an example of what can happen if you do it right. In the second Clinton administration, second 4 years, Bill Perry had been Secretary of Defense, and he was out of office. He was at Stanford. And he had the assignment from the president of quietly going around to Japan, North Korea, South Korea, China, Russia, and just talking about it, trying to get something to gel. And Bill was wonderful with that because everybody knew he was an extraordinary person. They knew he could walk into the Oval Office anytime he wanted. He had no ego. There was no publicity about this. He just was doing it. And he was getting somewhere. And he says one of the greatest thrills was he got the New York Philharmonic Orchestra to come to Pyongyang to play. And they played the Star Spangled Banner and everybody clapped. So you can get somewhere. And we have a little tract too with China that Henry Kissinger and Henry is the point man really. They respect him greatly in China as elsewhere. And we had a meeting in Washington, and the leaders of it, they're authoritative people. They took us aside, and they said, we want to work together to create a nuclear weapons-free Korean peninsula. But we can only do it if we could do it quietly. We can work together, but quietly, because we can't stir things up. We've got to work at it that way. So we passed that word on to Secretary Kerry. And this is a real opportunity. It's important. The next thing I see him leaving Beijing saying, hey, we've agreed to work on nuclear weapons in North Korea, in the Korean Peninsula. I say, come on, that's not the way to do it. We have over-politicized everything. Let me give you another story. One time I was in China. I flew back. I was lucky to land at Andrews Air Force Base. But it was on Friday morning. It snowed all day Friday. It snowed Friday night. It closed Saturday. And the Reagans were stuck in the White House. Our phone rings. And Nancy says, why don't you come on over and have supper with us? So my wife and I go over. And Nancy and the president started asking me about the Chinese leaders. What are they like? They have a sense of humor. They have a bottom line. Can you find their bottom line? What kind of people are they? Then they started asking me about the Soviet leaders because they knew when I was Secretary of Treasury, I had dealt with them a lot. This was the Carter cutoff of everything was still going on. And I had gotten permission to have once a week private meetings with Ambassador Brennan, and our object was to get the weeds out. So anyway, I'm listening. Nancy and the president are quizzing me about these people, and I'm sitting there and it's dawning on me. This man has never had a real conversation with a big-time communist leader, and he's dying to have one. So I said to Mr. President, and Nancy wants it, very important. So I said, Mr. President, on Tuesday afternoon at 5, Ambassador Brennan is coming over for one of our chats. What if I bring him over here and you talk to him? He said, that's a great idea. I'd like to talk to him. He said, well, I'll only take about 10 minutes. All I want to tell him is, if his new leader, Andropov, had just succeeded Brezhnev, if his new leader is interested in a constructive conversation, I'm ready. That was a bolt out of the blue. Nobody realized that that was his attitude. So we go, I bring Brennan over. We're there for at least an hour and a half. We talked about everything under the sun. He talked about Soviet Jewry. And it was impressive because he had names and places and incidents. It wasn't just a general thing. And then he talked about the Pentecostals. You remember in the Carter administration, a group of Pentecostals rushed into our embassy. They were still there. You couldn't expel them because they'd probably get killed. And yet it was very uncomfortable. And he kept saying, you know, it's like a big neon sign you have in Moscow saying, you don't treat people right, you don't let them worship the way they want, don't let them immigrate. You ought to do something about it. So Brennan and I are riding back to the State Department in the car, and we said, you know, why don't we make that our special project? So we had pieces of paper that went back and forth where little while. Finally, I got one that I thought was pretty good. And I took it over to the president. I said, Mr. President, any lawyer could tell you can drive a truck through the holes in this statement. But I have to believe, with all the background and the back and forth we've had, that if we get them out of the embassy, they'll be allowed to go home and eventually emigrate. So we decided to roll the dice. We got them to leave, and sure enough, they were allowed to leave. They're allowed to go home. And then they were allowed to emigrate with all their families, about 50 people. It was a giant event. And I said to the president, when he talked about this, he said, I just want something to happen. I don't say a word. I said, the deal is we'll let them out if you don't crow. So they got out. The president didn't say a word. The press was mystified. How did this happen? Not a word. And I always thought there was something of greater importance in this incident, because he learned that you can make a deal with these people and they'll carry it out. And they learned the same thing. They understood very well how tempting it is for American politicians to say, look what I did. He didn't do it. Said nothing. But it's an interesting little, this is an untold story, but it's a very important, because the way you build trust and confidence through actions makes a big difference. And for instance, Shevardnadze was the Soviet foreign minister. And I got to know him. First time, we were both at a big meeting, I think it was in Helsinki. And the next day after the meeting, we would have a one-on-one session. It was going to be in the American ambassador's residence. So we get to this meeting hall, and we're here, and he's over here, and I'd never met him, so I go around up and introduce myself. And I said, I've got an idea for you. He said, what's that? I said, we have these meetings, and there's, you speak, and then there's translation, then I speak, and then this translation takes forever. So we have a setup where we can have simultaneous translation. You have an earpiece, and you have a microphone. The translators and everybody are in another room. You don't even see them. And as you're talking, they're translating, and I'm hearing it. So I'm understanding what you're saying while you're saying it. And he said, fine, that's a good idea. I thought Brennan was going to die because you're not supposed to agree to anything. You're supposed to bargain. But Shevardnadze agreed. But over time, we became friends, sort of, and we engaged, and we always were candid and careful. And you begin to have a relationship with another person. You may have many, many differences, but still you can have a personal relationship of trust. And I always remember we had these discussions of issues of conflict, and one of them was their presence in Afghanistan. We're about to have a big meeting on the subject, and he said, George, I'd like to have a little private time beforehand. So we go into my back office. And he says, this has not been announced, and I don't know when it will be announced, but we have decided, past tense, have decided to leave Afghanistan. And I'm letting you know because maybe we can work a little together to minimize the loss of life as this process takes place. Now, he would never have told me that if he thought I was going to go out and tell the press, hey, look at this. Our policies produce this great deal. Of course, I didn't say anything. I told the president that's about all. And we did work and minimized the loss of life. But you can have that kind of relationship with an adversary. It can work.
And don't crow.
And don't crow.
Sir, turning to a topical subject, what you write about, immigration. Do we need a wall?
Yeah, because more Mexicans are leaving than are coming. We need to have a wall to keep them here because we need them. I think obviously we need control of our borders. That I agree with that. There's something called the North America Forum that I helped get going about 10 years or so ago. And we had a meeting in Mexico a month or so ago, and we had produced a study which was built there. And the study shows that fertility in Mexico, US, Canada, and the Central American countries is down to replacement level. So no big surge of young people being produced. People are getting older. That's happening in all these countries. And Mexico is a more prosperous country. So we're not having the surge of Mexicans. The biggest problem we have is Central Americans coming through Mexico. And we need to help Mexico avoid becoming a transit country. But you have to ask yourself, why are they coming? They're coming because of the violence in their own countries. What is the source of the violence? The violence is produced by drug gangs who are after each other. And what do they want? They are struggling to be part of the sale of illegal drugs in the United States. That's where all the money comes from. So if we want to get control of the immigration problem, let's get control of our drug problem. That's its cause. But I think that we must control our borders. There's no doubt about that. But a reasonable flow of people back and forth is a good thing. We have to be sensible about this. And when we started in, I felt, and I could reflect back on my time as Secretary of Treasury, there are European things and there are Asian things. We wanted to have a North America point of view. So we could work easily with Canada, but it was hard to get Mexico in. But we felt in the Reagan period that foreign policy starts in your neighborhood. If you go buy a house somewhere, you look at the house and all that, but the first thing you ask is, what's the neighborhood like? Is it safe? Are there schools handy? How do we go shopping? So the neighborhood is important. And we live in a neighborhood called North America, and we want it to be a strong, peaceful, stable, decent neighborhood. So my first trip out of the country as Secretary of State was to Canada. And the traveling press said, what are you going to Canada for? This is where we have the problems. I said, well, who do you think our biggest trading partner is? And they all said Japan or Britain or something. I said, you add all those countries together and they don't come up as much as Canada. So it's our biggest trading partner. There are more phone calls back and forth between Canadians and the US than any other two countries. So this is a big time. We've got to get along with our neighbor and build a neighborhood. My second trip was to Mexico. And gradually, President de la Madrid in Mexico changed things. He once told me the president used to have a yacht that'd go on the Potomac, and I got it when de la Madrid was in Washington, and we're drifting down the river talking, and he said, you can't believe what the Mexican government owns. Every time any business goes bankrupt, we take it over. So we own beauty parlors and grocery stores and all kinds of stuff. He said, we got to get rid of that. And he also took Mexico into the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, because he said, I want our people exposed to the world markets to make them more efficient. So he laid the groundwork for the arrival of Salinas and Pedro Aspe, and they really changed Mexico. And we were able to negotiate. We had negotiated a US-Canada free trade agreement. We were able to add Mexico under what's now called NAFTA. And it has worked really well. Our imports from Mexico are 40% US content, 40% US content. And Mexico has a considerable amount of exports to other countries, and probably around 40% of those exports are US content. So this is a good deal, and it helps build our neighborhood. So I think this notion of denigrating Mexico is totally stupid from our standpoint, and I hope that it gets rearranged in a proper way.
So you would recommend that to the next administration, be careful with NAFTA?
You can amend it and make it stronger. No doubt there are things to do, but it's actually working well and has worked well. And there's all kinds of evidence of that. We had an interesting conference. We had the people who negotiated NAFTA from the US, Canada, and Mexico, and some others down at Hoover, and we had a day-and-a-half discussion. We produced a book on the subject that's available. And it just shows what the negotiations were like and where the strains were and what's been accomplished. And it's not perfect, but it works pretty well.
Sir, your focus on economics throughout the book and your life as a trainee, PhD in economics. If you were advisor to the next administration, how would you advise them to structure your personal income tax and your corporate taxes?
On the personal income tax side, I think they should have a redo of the 1986 Tax Act. This was a tax bill. It was originally proposed by President Reagan, and it gradually made its way through the Congress. It wiped out preferences. And then the revenue that was gained from doing that was used to reduce rates. So the process was revenue neutral on the assumption that nothing would happen to the economy. But the economy was caused to move forward on that basis, so more revenue came in as a result of that. And people don't realize you can lower the rates and wipe out the preferences, and that's not a big loss of revenue. On the contrary, you can make it be revenue neutral. And it'll cause the economy to expand, and you'll be better off. In the case of the 1986 Tax Act, the trick in these things is to make them not bipartisan, but nonpartisan. It gradually became clear to everybody this was a good idea. It was introduced to the Senate by Dick Gephardt, who was the Democratic leader. Bill Bradley, a Democrat, had the laboring oar in the Senate. It passed the Senate 97-3. 97-3. In other words, it was nonpartisan. And somebody asked President Reagan if it bothered him that two Democrats introduced this legislation. You know what he said? It passed, didn't it? Those were the good old days. He and Tip O'Neill, somebody asked if Tip O'Neill was his adversary. He said, not after 6 o'clock. The two Irishmen could hoist a beer and get something settled. The last time anything was done on Social Security, they did it. And they got a committee appointed. Alan Greenspan was the head of it. And the deal was that whatever the committee recommended would go into effect unless one house or the other voted it down. So nobody had to vote for anything. They just have to not vote. And that was the last time anything was done, but they did it. Yeah. So you can do these things. And we have to get control of spending. And here's the problem. We have a gigantic national debt. And you don't feel it because the Federal Reserve has kept interest rates down practically at zero. So you don't see the burden. But let interest rates get up to 3 or 4%, which is not high. And the burden of the debt will be a significant proportion of the federal budget. Then you've got the entitlement programs keeping going. And they're going to be squeezing everything out. That's the problem. So we have to get control of the entitlement programs. And conceptually, it's not hard. Politically, it's hard. But conceptually, it's easy to see what you need to do.
Well, I wish we had more time. I tell you, I will ask you on K through 12 education. Could you make a point how it can be fixed?
Well, I think this is one place where I feel Mr. Trump has been very strong and right. He says we have to have choice. We have to get ourselves in a position where students can choose and their parents can help them choose where they want to go to school. That sets up competition. And competition will cause the schools to want to be better. There's a school in Oakland called the Oakland Military Institute. It was set up by Jerry Brown when he was mayor. And I was working a little bit with him on it. We saw how hard it was to get that school through the education bureaucracy. But it's basically a sort of a charter school. The kids come, they're the same kids that are in the regular public schools that come to this institute. They all graduate. They mostly all go to college. It's a huge success. And every student there is there because they chose to come. And the reason they chose to come is that they know they get a good education. So the school knows nobody will come unless we produce a good education. If you've got a lousy teacher, get rid of them. And that's the way you improve the situation, I think.
Okay. You know, if the audience here could read the book, it's not very thick, but I tell you, if I could have one wish, I would wish that I could get the president-elect to read the book himself. Because especially the chapter
Help yourself.
Huh?
Go ahead and do it. After you're a general, come on.
Especially the chapter called Governance, Family, Community, and Beyond. And as we need to close this program, I'd like to read a section about Paul Nitze's comments. He was the Deputy Secretary of State. To you at your farewell when you left the State Department as a secretary. He said this, Mr. Secretary, for us old-timers in the government, these years serving in your State Department have been unique. Within a week after you took over, it was evident that the Shultz regime would be different. The aim would be team play, not bureaucratic infighting. What would count was initiative, energy, and courage. We were confident you would back us up, and if we ran into personal opposition, you would back us up for pursuing forward-leading ideas, like the improved relationships between the Western countries and the Soviet Union, that raised human rights from a taboo subject to the forefront of the dialogue, and your success across the board from a START treaty, defense, and the outlawing of chemical and biological weapons. Then he closed by saying, what are the elements of character and leadership that have made this possible? I would like to list them as follows: being wholly comfortable within your skin, a common sense approach to problems, forthrightness in your relationships with others, confidence in the United States and the fundamental ideas informing its spirit. The result has been those of us who've been fortunate to be part of your team have been part of a great experience. We deeply thank you for it. Well, Mr. Secretary George Shultz, on behalf of those in the audience, we deeply thank you for enlightening us this evening. That's it.
Could I say one word? Mike Myatt has made really astonishing impact here in San Francisco. He's come here to this club, and he has rejuvenated it. He's put spirit into it. It's comfortable, it's clean, its service is great. Chow down, good chow. And it's been a terrific experience. One time, some time ago, Mike came to me, and he said he wanted to start a lecture series in my name. And I said, Mike, come on, there are more lectures in San Francisco. And then we started talking about it. At that time, the military were not appreciated in San Francisco very much. They'd all left, and the Vietnam War had its scars. And so then we said, look, why don't we have our lecturer be a high-ranking military official? That'll be, nobody else does that. So we agreed on that. At first, we had a hard time persuading anybody to come. They were afraid they might get shot. We finally got Jim Jones, when he was commandant, to come. And the room was full, and it was he gave a terrific lecture and Q&As. It was a great success. And then we got people to come, and we had General Dunford here recently. But one of the turning points was we had a big celebration in Union Square, and there was Korean War veterans were honored. And the Marine Band was there. And my wife, who's chief of protocol, had cleared the streets. And after the ceremony was over, the Marine Band marched from Munich Square down to the Marine Memorial. And San Francisco got behind, clapping and cheering, and we turned a corner. So never underestimate the Marine Corps Band.
Yes, that's right.
And never underestimate General Mike Myatt. Thank you, Mike.